The trouble began on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the neighborhood felt quiet, predictable, and almost idyllic. For years, the small cul-de-sac had prided itself on being orderly and well-maintained, the type of place where lawns were trimmed to near mathematical precision and driveways sparkled from weekly power washes. The homeowner, who had lived there longer than most of the current HOA board members, believed he understood every inch of the community's rules and expectations. His towering maple tree, planted by the previous owner decades ago, was one of the oldest features on the property and had earned the affection of neighbors and visitors alike. But that Tuesday morning, everything changed with a single piece of paper tucked under the front doormat. It didn't look like much, just a standard HOA notice printed on cheap paper, but the wording was so absurd it took a moment for the meaning to register. According to the letter, he was being fined for allowing the shadow of his maple tree to extend onto the sidewalk and, on sunny days, partially into the street. The notice claimed this shadow interfered with community aesthetic uniformity and potentially contributed to uneven lighting contrasts within the public walking experience. The homeowner reread the statement several times, certain he must be missing something. But no matter how he approached it, the conclusion remained the same. The HOA had decided that his tree's shadow, an intangible, immaterial, and naturally occurring consequence of sunlight, was a violation. It seemed impossible, unreasonable, and almost comical. But the fine attached to the notice was real, printed clearly at the bottom of the page, along with a warning that failure to comply would result in escalating penalties. He spent the rest of the morning pacing around the property, observing the way the sun moved across the branches and cast shadows along the walkway. The tree had never caused a single problem. Children played beneath it on summer afternoons. Neighbors paused under its canopy during jogs to catch their breath. Birds nested in the branches each spring, bringing flashes of color and bursts of song to the street. To think that the HOA would choose this, as their next battleground felt like nothing short of harassment. Later that afternoon, curiosity mixed with frustration pushed him to attend the weekly HOA meeting. The board members, seated at a long table in the community center, greeted him with the stiff, rehearsed politeness of people who had already decided how the discussion would go. They began reciting their reasoning before he even sat down, explaining that the shadow cast by his tree created visual clutter and potential hazards, though they struggled to specify exactly what hazards a patch of shade could possibly create. The board president, a woman known in the neighborhood for her strict interpretations of the bylaws and her fondness for issuing warnings, spoke as if the matter were indisputable. According to her, shadows could theoretically cause uneven walking conditions if they concealed imperfections in the concrete. Shadows could confuse drivers by altering depth perception. Shadows could, and here she paused to emphasize the point, interfere with the uniform brightness expected in community spaces. None of it made sense, and yet they remained firm. The board had already drafted an amendment to the rules, they explained, one that would allow them to regulate natural obstructions that influenced the community's overall aesthetic. The amendment had not yet been formally added to the official documents, but they insisted it provided adequate grounds for issuing the fine in advance of full ratification. Leaving the meeting, the homeowner felt a simmering anger mixed with disbelief. It was obvious that the board wasn't acting out of genuine concern for the neighborhood. This was pettiness transformed into policy, the kind of power play that happened when certain personalities ended up on HOA boards and discovered they could wield authority like a weapon. That night, he pulled out the thick binder that contained the HOA's official bylaws and settled into a long, deliberate study session. If they were going to weaponize the rules, he would need to know them better than they did. Page by page, he combed through clauses, subclauses, footnotes, and outdated provisions that had survived from previous iterations of the community. Most of it covered the usual topics: fencing, paint colors, noise restrictions, vehicle storage, but at the very back, tucked into a section that looked almost forgotten, he found something unexpected. The document included a clause stating that no rules or fines could be enforced retroactively, nor could any homeowner be penalized for naturally occurring phenomena unless the bylaws explicitly addressed them at the time of enforcement. Shadows, predictably, appeared nowhere in the document. Trees were mentioned only with regard to removal and maintenance, not the shapes they cast during daylight hours. In fact, the homeowner realized the HOA might be in clear violation by issuing the fine before officially approving the rule. The more he read, the clearer it became. Not only was the fine baseless, but the HOA had overstepped in a way that could be challenged formally. And if challenged, it wouldn't simply force them to drop the fine. It could expose the board's misuse of authority. The following morning, he conducted his own investigation around the neighborhood. If his tree's shadow was considered an infraction, then several other trees, including one directly in front of the HOA president's house, also cast shadows of similar or greater size across the sidewalks and roads. If uniformity was truly the concern, then enforcing the shadow rule fairly would require fining a significant portion of the neighborhood. The absurdity of it all strengthened his resolve. He spent the next few days gathering documentation, taking photographs at regular intervals to demonstrate the natural progression of shadows throughout the day. He researched state property laws, sunlight obstruction statutes, and HOA board accountability guidelines. By the end of the week, he had assembled a file thick enough to rival the HOA's own binder, and with it came a growing sense of confidence. When the second notice arrived, a harsher warning demanding payment of the fine within 10 days, he didn't feel anger. He felt something closer to anticipation. The board had given him exactly the leverage he needed. They were trying to corner him, but in their eagerness to control something as trivial as a shadow, they had made themselves vulnerable. That he drafted a formal response letter, one that cited specific violations of their own bylaws, along with multiple examples of discriminatory enforcement. He outlined the legal risks of implementing an unapproved rule and hinted, very subtly, at potential escalation if the board failed to withdraw the fine. It was a carefully constructed warning, polite in tone, devastating in implication. As he printed the letter and prepared to deliver it to the HOA, he felt the first spark of something that hadn't been present before. It wasn't just determination. It was the beginning of a plan, a strategy that, if executed properly, would not only clear his name but expose the board's incompetence to the entire neighborhood. And with that, he walked toward the next stage of the conflict, unaware that the shadow of his maple tree was about to trigger a full-scale HOA meltdown unlike anything the community had ever seen. The HOA board did not respond well to the homeowner's letter. In fact, they responded in exactly the way he hoped they would: poorly, hastily, and with a level of defensiveness that revealed far more than they intended. The board president, upon receiving the letter, immediately called an emergency meeting, citing threatening correspondence and attempts to undermine the authority of the HOA. Though he wasn't present at the meeting, word traveled quickly through the neighborhood. Several homeowners, quietly fed up with the board's increasingly arbitrary decisions, forwarded him updates within hours. Reports came in describing the board president pacing at the front of the room, gripping the letter with white knuckles, insisting the HOA must make an example of him before others followed his lead. Her insistence was met with shifting gazes and uncomfortable silence from the other board members, but none of them seemed ready to challenge her. It was clear that, at least for now, they intended to double down. The next morning, a new notice appeared, this one hand-delivered and far more aggressive in tone. It accused him of attempting to obstruct proper administrative function, warned of increasing fines, and stated that failure to comply could trigger a lien on his property. The wording was severe, legalistic, and dripping with manufactured authority. But beneath the bluster, he recognized the panic. They were trying to intimidate him into submission. What they didn't realize was that the homeowner had spent the last week preparing for this exact escalation. He had consulted state HOA guidelines, reviewed community association case law, and spoken quietly with a retired attorney living a few houses down, someone who had grown tired of the board's antics years ago and was more than willing to help. Together, they had mapped out every misstep the board had made so far, from issuing an unenforceable fine to attempting to apply an unapproved rule retroactively. The homeowner even discovered something particularly damning. The HOA president's insistence that the amendment had already been drafted revealed a procedural violation. According to the bylaws, any amendment must be announced to all homeowners at least 2 weeks before it could be voted on. No such notice had ever been sent. This meant the president had not only overstepped her authority but attempted to create a rule behind closed doors, an act that, if proven, could trigger a mandatory internal review and even removal from her position. Armed with documentation, he drafted a second letter, longer, sharper, and far more consequential. This time, he included photographs showing that multiple trees in the neighborhood cast similar shadows. He listed 5 specific bylaw violations committed by the board. He attached a copy of the clause stating the HOA could not penalize naturally occurring phenomena without explicit rules on the books. And, in a final stroke of preparation, he included a request to review all recent board meeting minutes and rule amendments, a request any homeowner could legally make but one that would expose whether the president had indeed been creating rules outside proper procedures. He sent the letter not only to the board but to every homeowner in the community. Within hours, phones were ringing, emails were flying, and neighbors were approaching him with mixtures of amusement, outrage, and relief. Many had endured their own minor battles with the HOA, petty citations, vague warnings, and fines that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The shadow fine was simply the most absurd, but it was also the catalyst they needed. The community began showing signs of fracture almost immediately. Some homeowners who previously kept to themselves now openly voiced their frustrations. A few began to scrutinize their own notices from the HOA and discovered questionable inconsistencies. Others admitted they had been fined for rules that never appeared in the official bylaws. A quiet shift in power was beginning. Days passed, and the HOA board found itself surrounded by pressure. The board president attempted to maintain control, insisting to anyone who would listen that the homeowner was manipulating the community and misrepresenting the facts. But the more she tried to explain the shadow rule, the more absurd she sounded. Residents began gathering outside after work, discussing the situation openly, laughing about the ridiculousness of policing shadows, and questioning the judgment of those who governed them. The board president's frustration grew. She issued another notice claiming the homeowner was now responsible for disrupting community unity, but it only fueled the fire. Neighbors shared the notice in group chats and social forums, mocking the escalating list of invented violations. Then, the breaking point came. One afternoon, the homeowner found a letter slipped through his mail slot, not from the board but from one of its members. The note, written in a careful hand, explained that things inside the board had reached a boiling point. Several members had begun questioning the president's decisions, and 2 were considering resigning if she continued pushing the shadow rule. There were rumors of misconduct, of rules passed informally over text messages, and of selective enforcement against homeowners the president personally disliked. The board was unraveling. Realizing the time was right, the homeowner prepared the next stage of his plan. A formal petition calling for a special community meeting to review the board's actions and, if necessary, vote on disciplinary measures. The bylaws required signatures from 20% of the homeowners, an amount he reached within a single evening. People signed eagerly, grateful that someone had finally stood up to the board. Some even volunteered information about their own unfair fines, adding to the growing evidence of systematic abuse of power. When the board president learned of the petition, she reacted with fury. She attempted to issue an emergency restriction on community gatherings, claiming safety concerns, but the attempt failed immediately. There was no such provision in the bylaws. Her loss of control was becoming visible to everyone. And so, with the community backing him and the board wobbling under the weight of public scrutiny, the homeowner delivered the petition to the HOA's official mailbox. The special meeting was officially triggered. It would take place in 3 days. Quietly, he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun descend behind the maple tree. The shadow stretched across the sidewalk as it always had, a constant, natural part of the neighborhood that had existed long before the current board arrived. But now, the shadow represented far more than a tree's outline. It had become the symbol of a community waking up, of a flawed system beginning to collapse, and of a board president whose obsession with control would soon bring about her undoing. The stage was set. The board was cornered, and the next 3 days would determine just how far the meltdown would go. The special meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the neighborhood was usually quiet, with families tending to gardens and children riding bicycles up and down the sidewalks. But on this particular Saturday, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Neighbors began gathering outside the community center long before the appointed time, drawn not only by the petition but by weeks of growing frustration that had finally reached a breaking point. The homeowner arrived early, carrying a neatly organized folder filled with documents, photos, and printouts, evidence painstakingly collected over the course of the conflict. He was greeted with nods, murmurs of encouragement, and the quiet solidarity of a community that had long felt unheard. The absurdity of the shadow fine had sparked something deeper, a collective realization that the HOA board's misuse of power had gone unchallenged for far too long. Inside the community center, folding chairs had been arranged in rows, and a long table at the front held pitchers of water and stacks of papers. The board members were already seated. Their expressions ranged from uneasy to openly hostile. The board president, rigid and silent, stared straight ahead. Her jaw clenched so tightly it seemed her teeth might crack under the pressure. The chair beside her was conspicuously empty, a quiet signal that one board member had already resigned before the meeting even began. As everyone settled into their seats, the tension in the room thickened. The board president opened the meeting with a strained attempt to maintain authority, announcing the agenda and insisting that the accusations brought forward were misunderstandings, inflated by misinformation. But her voice, usually sharp and commanding, trembled at the edges. The room was no longer hers to control. The homeowner waited until the floor opened for statements. When his turn came, he stepped forward not with outward anger, but with calm precision. He placed his folder on the podium, opened it carefully, and began recounting the events from the beginning: the initial shadow fine, the lack of any relevant rule, the discovery of retroactive enforcement violations, and the procedural breaches surrounding the so-called amendment. He spoke of the absurd justifications the board had given, the threats of liens, and the documented examples of selective enforcement throughout the neighborhood. He mentioned not only his own experiences, but those of others who had quietly approached him in the days leading up to the meeting. Each example chipped away at the board's credibility. Each detail reminded residents of the ways they had been made to feel powerless. He presented photographs of shadows cast by multiple trees, including the large oak in the board president's front yard, demonstrating that if his shadow was truly a violation, then half the neighborhood should be fined. He displayed the clause in the bylaws stating that natural phenomena could not be penalized without explicit rules. He showed the text of the petition, signed by dozens of homeowners. By the time he finished, the room had fallen into a heavy, contemplative silence. The weight of the evidence hung in the air like an anchor dragging the board down. Then, slowly, conversations broke out among the attendees. Frustrated homeowners began voicing their own experiences: unfair fines, unexplained warnings, and rules applied only to certain households. Some spoke with quiet resignation, others with a bitterness that had clearly been building for years. The board president attempted to respond, but the moment she started speaking, the room pushed back. Her explanations were met with skepticism. Her insistence that the shadow fine was part of a broader safety initiative was dismissed. Her claims that the homeowner had misinterpreted the rules were easily countered by direct citations from the bylaws now circulating among the attendees. A second board member stood to defend her, only to be met with questions he couldn't answer. When asked whether the amendment had ever been properly announced or voted on, he hesitated, just long enough for the room to understand the truth. The amendment had never existed in any legitimate form. It had been an attempt to create authority where none existed. At that point, the community had heard enough. One of the longest-standing residents rose from his seat, his voice steady and clear as he called for a vote of no confidence in the board president. The suggestion rippled across the room, strengthening as more voices echoed their support. The bylaws allowed for such a vote during a special meeting, provided a majority of attendees agreed. The board president paled, but she had no way to stop what happened next. Hands were raised, dozens of them, some hesitant, others emphatic, but all united. When the count concluded, the result was undeniable. An overwhelming majority had voted for her removal. It was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of release, the slow exhale of a community that had finally taken back control. The board president stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor as she gathered her belongings with jerky movements. She left without a word, the door swinging shut behind her with a finality that reverberated through the room. The remaining board members slouched in their seats, disoriented and defeated, while the community began discussing the steps required to rebuild the HOA from the ground up. In the days that followed, an interim committee was formed, composed of level-headed volunteers who had no interest in wielding power for the sake of control. They immediately suspended all pending fines issued under questionable circumstances, including the infamous shadow violation. Neighbors who had avoided speaking to one another for years began reconnecting, united by the shared experience of dismantling the very system meant to serve them. The homeowner's maple tree continued casting its long, graceful shadow over the sidewalk and street, just as it always had. But now, when residents passed by, they didn't see a violation or a problem. They saw the symbol of the moment their community found its voice again. As for the homeowner, he returned to his quiet routines, grateful the ordeal had come to an end. But every so often, as he sat beneath the shade of the old tree, he couldn't help but reflect on how something as small as a shadow had sparked such monumental change. It had exposed corruption, united neighbors, and brought balance back to a place that had drifted too far into pettiness and control. And in the end, it wasn't anger or force that toppled the board. It was knowledge, patience, persistence, and the simple refusal to let absurdity go unchallenged. With the board rebuilt, the bylaws clarified, and the community stronger than it had been in years, the homeowner knew the battle had been worth every minute. The HOA had tried to fine him for his shadow, but the only thing they truly cast was their own downfall.